Everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled, Why is this happening? Addressing the deeper questions in the midst of crisis, to be presented by Alwiza Dr. Saira Sabzali. My name is Deborah Samani. I will be the moderator for the webinar, which will be approximately an hour long, with approximately 40 minutes allotted for the presentation and 15 minutes for a question and answer period. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few things. First, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to be with us today, to explore, to be curious, and to be inspired. And thank you to all of the volunteers and resources that have made this webinar possible. At this time, I'd like to remind everyone about the access line that allows you to access resources, information, or assistance of any type. The number is 1-888-536-3599. You can also visit iicanada.org for further information on how to contact the access line. We'll share that number and website again later. Before we begin the presentation, I'll share a quick bio of Dr. Alwiza Saira Sabzali and want to thank you, Dr. Sabzali, for sharing your time with us today. We really appreciate it and we're really excited for you to get started.
Me too, I'm so excited.
Thanks.
Let's do it.
All right, so I just want to share a little bit of background about you. Alwiza Dr. Saira Sabzali is a psychotherapist who takes a whole person approach to mental health, helping clients incorporate their cultural values and spiritual beliefs into therapy. She specializes in depression, anxiety, and family harmony, and runs online support groups. Dr. Saira has delivered 2 TEDx talks and teaches in the Counseling Therapist program at Stenberg College in Surrey, BC. She provides free mental health education through her YouTube channel, Dragonfly, and Wellness TV. Alwiza will now begin with the presentation, and I will join again in the second half of the webinar to go through your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Deb, for that beautiful introduction. I am so excited to be here, everyone. Thank you for joining us. You know, I've done lots of webinars and seminars, as many people probably have over this time, but this topic is so particularly close to my heart. And so we're talking about why this is happening and looking at some of those deeper questions that we're facing in the midst of this crisis that we're all going through together. So I want to start with this concept of sunlight versus moonlight. You know, when things are bright and our days are clear, it's easy to be nice to people. It's easy to be hopeful. It's easy to be grateful. But it's at those times when we're in the darkness and we're in the moonlight that it becomes a little more challenging. And I wanted us to think about this metaphor of sunlight versus moonlight. And particularly in our tradition, we can compare that to Zahir and Batin, right? So sunlight, Zahir, it's obvious, it's in front of you. We don't even really notice the sun unless it's a cloudy day and we haven't seen the sun for a while, then we notice. Moonlight is something you have to kind of seek out, right? You have to kind of look on a certain night, the moon is bright, and that's when you see it. And so if we could think of this time that we're going through as a kind of dark night, where we're looking for guidance, we're looking for that brilliant but different kind of light of the moon. There's a book that I've been reading that I wanted to share with you. There's a couple of books that I'll introduce to you throughout this presentation. One of them is called The Dark Night of the Soul by Thomas More. And what it talks about in that book is how many times in kind of modern day, we try to push away the darkness, right? We try to say, oh, I want to feel better. I want things to be good. This doesn't feel good, so push it away. And what various traditions, faith traditions, wisdom traditions around the world talk about actually being strong enough to be brave enough to actually go into the darkness. It's not something that you would do. It's not something for the faint-hearted, right? You have to have such courage and such inner strength. And right now, many of us don't feel very strong. Many of us feel tired, frustrated, irritated, trapped. There's all of these experiences that we're having, and it's hard to rally that hope. And so that's what this presentation is about today, is getting us to think a little bit differently about this situation that we're in, beyond just the logistical pieces, beyond the positive thinking and the, learning 5 languages while you're in, isolation. It's not about that. It's about seeing this experience as part of our soul's journey. Right? Seeing this experience as a turning, a mandatory turning away from the sunlight to look at the moon and to look at the inner, the darkness, the hidden parts of our existence. I wanted to share something with you from another book. I told you there'll be books happening. So this is called Physicians of the Heart, and it's written by Sufi authors, and they talk about all these different ways of looking at the names of Allah, right? And so one of the things when we think about Zahir and Batin, when we think about the visible and the hidden, I want to read you here from this. It talks about that we look at the material realm and we believe that it will constantly be around, that it's eternal. Some people are totally caught up in their material possessions, absorbed with the goal of consolidating objects. Their view of inner reality is full of objects, and their external reality is full of objects as well, preoccupied with objects. It also goes on to talk about time. So it says others are pressured by time. It's not about objects, it's the relationship with time that's pressuring them. And actually that relationship with time is a demonstration of a disconnection from the timelessness of God, right? If you think about what this I don't even know what to call it, this difficult time, these strange times have done for us, it's for many of us really look at what has been important to us. What have we been bringing into the light? What have we prioritized in our lives? And for many of us, that's been objects, right? That's been collecting things, or it's been about time, rushing around here and there and doing all of these things. And this period of time gives us an opportunity to stop, to just stop and actually go inside, to stop looking out there for something to fill us and start really considering what's in here. It's a difficult thing to do, but it's one of the things, inshallah, that will move us through these times. And so as you go along through your day, consider that, right? Is this a sunlight thing that's happening where it's bright and it's easy and it's cheerful and I can do this? Or is this a time that requires me to look to the moonlight and be okay with the darkness and be okay with the discomfort and just sit in it for a while and feel that the changes that happen there, because that's where the change happens, right? Change happens when we're overcoming struggle, overcoming a challenge. That's when change happens, not when everything's fine, because then nobody feels like they need to change. So again, seeing this time as an opportunity for us to shift our attention towards the hidden, towards the dark, towards the inner. This is the time for some deep questions, and many of us have been asking some of these questions, right? So why is this happening? Why is this happening? And there's all sorts of theories, right? People have all these theories, but really that's a personal question. Why is this happening to you? Why is this happening to your family? And different families are going to be having different experiences right now, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But that question will come up, and it's really natural. It's really natural. If you're asking some of these questions, it tells us that we're on a search, right? That we don't have all the answers. And this talk that we're doing here in the next few minutes, 40 minutes, it's not about necessarily finding answers. It's about being willing to ask difficult questions. To ask the question, what does this mean? What is my new normal? Not just in a physical sense of my work and school and human relationships, but what is my new normal from a spiritual perspective? You know, our Jamaat Khana is closed. Our Jamaat Khana is closed. And that's affected us. So how will we tell the story of that time, of that loss? And as we think about how we'll tell these stories, sometimes words aren't really enough. Sometimes you need art, poetry, dance, and song. And you may have noticed in the weekly reflections, the Friday night reflections that are done where we get to see our president, there's always an artistic component. There's music. And I don't know about you, but when I listen to some of those songs, sometimes I don't even know what the words mean, but I feel something. And it's a place for those feelings to come out. How will we tell this story? Will we tell this story with heart? Will we tell this story with depth? Or will we just talk about, oh, I did this and then I did that? Or will we tell the story as this was a time of absolute transformation for us? It was not easy. It was not easy, but we moved through it together, one Jamaat, together at home, right? That's their little tagline, together at home. So I want to talk a little bit about our Jamaat Khanas. And, you know, again, it's hard to articulate for many of us what it means to have lost those spaces. For some of us who maybe weren't that regular at Jamaat Khana, just knowing that that space was there for us to go to, that was something in itself. And it's like after we lost it, we realized what we had lost. And so we'll talk about some other losses as we go, but just this piece around Jamaat Khanas. And when we get to that section about losses, I want to share with you a poem. And so watch for that. So here we are, the losses. There have been many, 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 many losses. And I picked this particular image because, you know, we have our technology. People are online and they're meeting virtually and they're doing these different kind of creative methods to connect. But at the end of the day, many of us feel very alone, especially those who live alone. It's a really hard time. And so, yeah, we might be cheerful on our meeting for work, but many of us have felt this way, just like, oh, how do we get through this? And if you start counting the losses, right? The business losses, the income losses, the health losses, the family members that have passed away, whether through COVID or something else, and not being able to go to those funerals, like that's big. And I think it's important that we talk about these things. We don't have to just pretend everything is fine. We, in our families, to be willing, to be courageous, to have these conversations about what is it that we've lost. Of course, there's things we've gained. And you see that, right? All over social media. It's like this gain and that gain, but also there have been losses. And I think it's really important, again, from a spiritual perspective, to be honest about some of those difficulties that many, many members in our Jamaat have experienced. And so, as I mentioned, one of those losses is the loss of our Jamaat Khana space. And, you know, I was having a hard time kind of articulating to my kids what it meant for me and my husband and our parents that Jamaat Khana is closed, because that has never happened in my lifetime, in my parents' lifetime, and it's around the world. And so as a global community, a global family, I think this is something that we have to acknowledge. We have to be willing to grieve. And we know it's not forever. We know it's temporary. And, you know, when we have our leadership calls, like I was appointed for Panch Barsal, so we're Panch Barsal Mukhi in our Jamaat Khana, and when we have our Mukhi Kamriya calls, there's so much optimism and hope, like this is not forever. But, you know, we just had Eid, we had Navroz, we had Laylatul Qadr, and it was a very different experience not to be able to be in that Jamaat Khana space. And so I wanted to share with you a poem. This is a book that I wrote, actually, of poetry, and here's the poem for us, for those Jamaat Khana, for the missing of Jamaat Khana. It's called A Jagged Goodbye. Since we parted paths, I keep retracing the steps. The goodbye was brutal, sudden, shorter than the time it took for my eyelids to flutter. And now the light is distant. I can see it, remember its warmth, but my skin still yearns for its heat. I see you everywhere, in everything, in the walk of that boy, the eyes of the shopkeeper, the smell that takes me swiftly, knocking me out and leaving me spinning. Why didn't I stop you, run into your arms and hold on? My life depends on it, and how can I go on? Those few moments sustaining me for the remaining hours of my life, hours that will be peppered with my memories and a bond of a new kind. They told me true love can never be lost, just transformed. I pray this transformation passes swiftly, else I will remain here in this jagged place of mirror shards where once stood the beloved. And so I would ask you to just take a moment and let those words really land with you. It's hard to describe what it feels like when you're grieving, and whether you're grieving loss of financial security, the loss of friendships and community, social relationships because you can't physically be in the same space. Whether it's the loss of your routine and your schedule, it could even be just a loss of your gym membership, right? There's all of these losses, and one is piled on top of the other. And so I wanted to start this and speak this at the very beginning, that it's important for us to acknowledge these losses. Now, we don't want to stay here, right? In the grief and the despair. There is a way to move forward. But if we don't acknowledge it, there's a term in transpersonal psychology, which is what I'm trained in. So transpersonal psychology is that intersection between psychology and spirituality. And there's a term that we use called spiritual bypass. And what it means it's when people say, oh, it's fine, God is there, Mola will look after us. And they don't actually do the deep work of going inside and seeing what's hurting in there. And expressing that, letting that out so that you can move through it. Not just fly over it, but actually move through it. That's what grows our soul. That's what grows our soul, being willing to face the darkness. And then having the tools and the faith to move through it. And that's what we'll talk about now. The balm. The balm, the way through, is about going inward. There is so much advice out there right now. So many people telling us what to do with our time, with our energy, with our food, with our families, with our work. There's so much content coming at us. And it can be very overwhelming. I was looking up, there's all these different conferences online. There's so much going on. And there's a lot of, even though we're, at home, for many of us, there's a lot of busyness. And I want to take a minute here to acknowledge all of our brothers and sisters that are working on the front line. So our healthcare workers, our essential workers, our frontline people that are out there every single day and have been out there every single day for months, putting their lives literally on the line to look after us. Thank you. And for you especially, I can imagine, I'm not in that space, but I could imagine that it would be an even more externally stressful time, an even more externally charged time. And the only way through this is to go inside, to go inside. That's not what anybody else is telling us to do, really, except maybe Hazari Mom or other spiritual teachers, right, are saying to go inside. But generally, we're not really talking about going inward. And so I would ask myself, and I would ask you to ask yourself, what are some of the things that help you to go inside? Perhaps it's daily prayer. Perhaps it's your tasbih, remembering the names of God. Perhaps it's song, devotional singing in our tradition or in other traditions. Perhaps it's quiet stillness, that personal internal search for the divine. But whatever way we go inward, for some of us it might actually be walking in nature, and that helps us to really come inside of ourselves. It's important for each and every one of us to use this time to figure that out. What is it for me and my family, the members of my family, that help us go inward? And can we build time for that? Right? Can we build time for that? Can we make sure that our weeks and even our days are balanced, where we're spending some time to go inward. And again, what that looks like for one family member versus another will likely be different. And there's some things that we know are very important to do communally, right? In every faith tradition, to come together, whether it's physically or whether it's virtually, but to have touch points of others who also believe in going inward. These are strange times, and we're not going to find the answers out there. I mean, that's funny I say that because you're on a webinar looking for some answers out there. But even in this webinar, like to actually hear the words, not just from a rational, logical, emotional place, but from a heart and soul place. To hear it from the inside. Because it's the inside that gets to grow right now. While the outside is so still. While we're not collecting things and rushing around, driving and getting there at a certain time. I know that's one of the things for me. It's like, I don't have to drive there and be there at a certain time. But then what are we going to do with our time? And many of us have just filled up our time, like with nonsense, things that we don't really need to be doing. And so for me and my family, what we're doing is looking at what does a day look like? And what are some of the things that actually really fill us up in the day? And what are things that are just wasting of time. And that's not to say we shouldn't be engaging in leisure and recreation and entertainment. Those are absolutely important. One of the best ways to discharge deep emotion is to play, right? So for children, we know what that looks like, play. For adults, our play looks like music and literature and film. So yes, you can watch some TV and it's okay, right? But choosing what you're watching, is it growing you? Is it helping you? Is it helping you give you a place to just move some of the energy that's on the inside? And so I would say that out of all the advice that's out there, what really matters is what's speaking to you from in here, that still, quiet, soft voice that speaks to us, that reminds us who we are. Has your mom sent us a letter, and we can read that letter, and it's really rich and full of support, right? And we want to remember that though there might be a physical letter, that message that our guide has for us are always coming. There's an internal dialogue that we have with the divine that's always on, no matter if shops are open or not. Right? That conversation is going. We don't always pay attention to it, right? The moon is out every night. We can't always see it. We don't always look for it, but it's there. Even when it's covered with clouds, it's there. That conversation is happening. And so part of the opportunity of this time is to take some time, really carve out some time and spend it going inward. Maybe in some ways that you've done through your own tradition, through rites and practices, traditions and practices. Maybe it's something different that's uniquely yours. Maybe it's journaling, who knows? There are some things that we share collectively that we do together, and then there's some things that are personal, and that's what this is partly about, that willingness to go inward. So how do we actually honor this time? When we look to wisdom traditions around the world, long before the religions of today, people understood that there was something very kind of mystical about the moon. There was something very special about the night. And, in various traditions around the world, people will actually get up in the middle of the night for prayer and reflection and spiritual search. And so there's something really important about that time that many of us just sleep through, right? So I want to read you another poem, and this is about the difference in the way that we approach night versus day. And so it's called When the Light Fades. The fear creeps into my bones. Everything is ending as the light fades. What holds us together but this thread of a dream? What binds us but that imprint on my soul? What makes him find my eyes but the sun he sees in me? And what to do as this sun begins to set? Maybe it's the moon that will speak for us now. The mystery and sweetness of the seaside changes, the salty air as ocean crashes over us. Maybe all we need is moonlight, as we have learned to find each other in the darkness. And so pause. Take some time to pause. And then listen. We might be asking for things. We might be praying for things. We might be imploring for things. But that's a one-way conversation. The other part of the dialogue with the divine is to listen, to actually listen, to stop and make space that we can actually hear what is being said to us. Some of that will be through some very clear messages, and some of those messages, many of those spiritual messages tend to be subtle, right? They tend to be subtle, signs, coincidences, connections. Listen. Many of us ask first, right? We say, this is what I want. Whoever's up there, this is what I want. But what if we waited to ask and first we paused? We took stock of what's happening. Then we were willing to listen, to see what's already available to me. And then we asked, sincerely asked for what it is. And you know, there's all, again, so many different ideas about how do you ask for what you want, right? And there's mainstream psychology ideas, there's spiritual ideas, there's religious ideas, there's all of these different ideas. But if we were to truly believe that our Creator is almighty, if we were to truly believe that our Creator is all-knowing, then the sweetest prayer would be, I ask you to do what you know is right for us. We can't always see the plan. If you look back on your life over the last 10 or 15 years, there will be milestones, there will be moments that were maybe very, very difficult. Maybe the loss of a loved one, maybe a very difficult ending of a relationship, maybe an illness. But when you look back, you can see how that fits into the story of your life. You can see how it made you the person that you are today. Right now, we're in the middle of it, so we're not going to know how this is actually going to play out for us 10 years later. But if we ask from the bottom of our heart for whatever we want, and then trust, right? And then trust that all-knowing presence to give us what we need so that we can grow. So that we can grow. Think of all the ways that you've grown in the last few weeks. Think of all the things that you never knew before that you now know. Think of the emotions that you haven't felt for a long time that you've now started feeling. Not all of this growth is easy. And in our tradition in Islam, we talk about, the reed flute. Rumi talks about the reed flute. And so there's these reeds in a reed bed, right? And they're all just blowing in the wind. And it's only when the reed is cut from the reed bed and fashioned into something that it makes a beautiful sound. That process of being cut from the reed bed, being processed, that's not an easy or gentle event. That's life-changing, that's transformational. And yet that is what it takes to make that beautiful music. And so being willing to see this time as a time when we can grow, when we can stretch ourselves beyond what we thought was possible. And not in a, everything's fine, don't worry about it, not in that sort of way, but in a deep, meaningful way from the inside. And so now is the time to write your story. For many of us, it can feel like there's been this puzzle, right, of life. What is life? It's all these different puzzle pieces, and we've been trying to put them together in a particular way to make a life story. And perhaps we can look at, what has this time given us? What new puzzle pieces has this period of our lives given us to change our story? I'm not going to lie and say this is an easy time. It is not. but it's a time of transformation. Absolutely. And so how will you write your story? Will you be the main character directing the play, or will you allow that creator of yours, will you allow that divine presence to write the script for you? And then try to make some sense of it, try to make meaning of it. And that's not to say that you're, again, as we talked about earlier, that spiritual bypass, right? It's we do our part. Absolutely, we do our part. And part of that is that courage, that fortitude, that grit to move through. In this book, The Physicians of the Heart, one of the things that they do in the book is they go through the 99 names of Allah, and they talk about, ways of seeing those 99 names. And so one of the names you might be familiar is Ya Sabur, and Sabur is about, generally that's translated as the patient one, but it's more than that. So a Sabur is that divine power that will see things through to the end. So at the human level, it's about that inner stillness, that inner equanimity, that non-moving steadiness that will sustain you while all of this is going on around of us. It's that stillness and that resolution to be still until the end. Again, that's not to say we're not going to get emotional, we're not going to be upset, but from a spiritual perspective, we are not shaken. Many of us have been shaken, and it's understandable. And one of the things that we do in our family is we keep connecting, like kind of from our imagination to the Jamaat kind of spaces and to our Imam. And other people from different traditions will do that with their own faith traditions, right? Connecting to those places of worship, connecting to your spiritual teachers and guides. You don't have to be there physically. In our tradition, for thousands of years, there were Jamaats that never saw the Imam. And yet there was that link. There was that connection. There was that patience. As-sabur. Ya sabur. So it's also about, and again, I think it's really important to make this point for everyone who's watching, that it's not to say you just have to pretend everything's fine. It's not fine. It's important to have honesty around that. But it is the time to look at what really are our values, right? It's easy, like I mentioned at the beginning, it's easy to be fun and friendly and generous and thoughtful when things are good. It's a lot harder to be fun and friendly and generous and thoughtful when you're in the dark night, when it's the moon that's guiding your path. Part of our opportunity is to deepen our introspection, our willingness to look inside. And so as we're writing our story, of course, guided by our creator, what is it going to look like? Will yours be a story of moving through, a story of quiet victory, a story of patience and faith and deep, deep soul search? Or will yours be a story of everything stopped and then everything started again, and then you were just the same person? You get to decide that. You, your family, you get to decide that. What will this time mean for us? What will be your story? I want to shift and let you know of some resources that I've been referring to as we've been going along. So one is Dark Nights of the Soul. This book here, it's a little bit of a different cover, but this is a really, really good read for those who are having a hard time with the depth of emotion that might be going on for you at this time. A really, really good read. Because again, it reframes the story, right? It's in the modern day, we're all kind of moving to sunshine and happiness and good, but sometimes the spiritual surge takes us to these deep inner places that can be dark and can be a bit overwhelming. And it's, one of the things that is often said is it's only when the child cries that the mother comes to give milk, right? It's only when we reach out, when we call out, is when the support comes, when the love comes, when the response comes. And so that's the dark nights of the soul. For those who have children, up to, teenage in their 20s, The Spiritual Child, it's a really, really good read. It's a bit academic, so you can skip over some of those complicated parts if you find it too much, but it talks about, it's really fascinating. It talks about the research that's been done with children and their spirituality. And see, what happens a lot of the times in psychology anyway, is that this research gets done, but then if it's not kind of aligned with the mainstream, it gets put in these very vague journals that are somewhere over there. Nobody really reads them. And so what Dr. Lisa Miller has done is she's brought all those articles together and put them in one place and talked about how spirituality is actually a huge protective factor. I want to tell you about one experiment that I don't know if she talks about it or I heard about it during my training, but there was a study that was done, and what they did was they had 3 groups of people. And so in the first group, so these 3 groups of people were all kind of, they had the common cold, like just they were kind of under the weather. This is way before COVID. This has nothing to do with COVID. It's a different thing altogether. So 3 groups of people all had kind of cold-like symptoms, not during this time, back in the past, and I think it was the 2000s. The first group, there was no intervention. They just left them, and then they just tracked their symptoms and how long it took for them to get better. The second group, they had other people praying for them. Okay, but they didn't tell those people that anybody's praying for you. The third group, they had people praying for them, and they told them that people are praying for you. So what they found was actually astounding. What they found was both the groups that had people praying for them got better faster than the group where nobody was praying for them. But what was more fascinating is this: whether they knew it or not. So if they knew someone was praying for them, they got better faster. If they didn't know someone was praying for them, they got better at the same rate. So there's so much incredible power that we have that maybe science hasn't caught up with yet. But it's there. Your prayers matter. When you think lovingly of that family member that's living alone, that matters. When you remember what it felt like to play Rasra with your community, and you remember and you hold that in your heart, that matters. When you reach out just for a quick phone call or text message to someone that just pops into your mind, that matters. Trust that. And so The Spiritual Child, this book talks about some of those really interesting experiments and research findings that have happened around spirituality and how to raise children and not be afraid. One of the things that they talk about in the book is, we sometimes are uncomfortable to talk to our kids about spiritual things because we're still searching. So how are we going to have answers for them? But what it talks about in this book is it's not really about having answers. It's about being willing to ask difficult questions and telling your kids, I'm also trying to figure that out. None of us really knows. We have theories, right? Our different faiths say different things about what happens, but like really, as far as like a rational, logical thing, we don't rationally know it yet. What happens after you die? What happens, to the soul? How does it come? How does it go? Like, we have all these ideas, and faith gives us a compass for that. But at the end of the day, we want to tell our children, like, this is how we answer those questions. Our faith gives us a framework with which to answer some of these difficult questions, and some questions will never be answered. Right? Some will be a consistent search for the rest of our lives. And so to be able to have those conversations with our kids and feel competent in those conversations, it's a great read. So last book is this one, which is the Physicians of the Heart. As I mentioned, so the whole name of the book is A Sufi View of the 99 Names of Allah, Physicians of the Heart. So another really, really great read to go a little bit deeper into some of the beautiful traditions that we have. They talk in the book about Zahir and Batin, and how Zahir is the obvious, and how, we don't even sometimes notice the sun, right? It's just there. The Batin, however, the hidden, we have to go looking for that often. And so and if we don't, it'll still be there. Right, for whenever we're ready to go looking for. So really, really interesting read for those who are interested in, moving forward and moving deeper into this conversation. The book that I read from my poetry, that's called Imprints on My Soul, Poetry in Search of the Beloved. for those who might be interested in reading more about that. Thank you for joining us. We're going to shift now to the questions that we have.
Thank you so much, Eliza. Thank you for sharing your knowledge and passions with us. Your presentation was very insightful, inspirational, and informative. And there are a number of questions coming through as well. So we'd like to begin with the question and answer portion of the webinar. We'll start with the first question. There is so much uncertainty and so many mixed messages out there. How do we manage and who do we listen to?
That's a really good question. And I spoke a little bit to that in the presentation, right? How there's all of this information that's coming at us, and it can be hard to know who to listen to. One of the things I'll say right off the bat is think about the source, right? So if you're getting, for example, information about the illness or symptoms, or who's writing that? Is it the Center for Disease Control, or is it, you know, Sally from her basement blogging? Like, who's actually writing that? So being sure that we're getting our news and our information from credible sources as far as what's happening in the environment, that's really, really important. But also trusting that inner voice that we have. And, you know, we in our community, we have Hazar Imam, right? And so he has faith that this thing is moving from the letters that he sent us. And so I feel like if we just keep that in mind, that's a guidance for us to say, okay, you know what, it's temporary, it's difficult, but it's temporary. And we have our ways of going inside, and that's going to be the strongest information, in addition, of course, to those technical pieces of, you know, what the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and our provincial governments and what all those people are saying. That's where we should be getting our information. I would discourage people. I know that there's all these like WhatsApp conversations and Facebook posts, and so really be mindful as you're forwarding the information. Is this credible? Is this based on whose ideas are these? Is it somebody who's researched it, somebody who knows about it, or is it just somebody's opinion? So I think that's something, if we keep that in mind, it'll help us understand who we should be listening to.
That's great advice. Thank you so much. So the next question that we have coming in, if Allah is all-knowing, why would he put us through this crisis, which has caused so much agony?
It's a really good question. And, you know, I can hear in that question the sadness. I can hear in that question a bit of hopelessness. And I would say, if we look at our human history, there have been so many periods of time that we've suffered, right? There have been natural disasters. There have been plagues. There have been other kind of extreme things that have wiped out large sections of humanity. And part of the piece around faith is that we trust that there's a big picture story going on. We're not the only creatures on this planet, right? We're, of course, the stewards of the earth, but there's a planet, there's animals, there's all of this, there's context, there's universes, there's much more than this human experience. And so trusting that creator of all of that there's something, and it's hard to do when you're hurting, right? And so I would say first being okay and willing to look at that, the sadness and the hopelessness, and that's there, to not pretend it's not there. And I think this is a time for many people, in the conversations I've been having with our brothers and sisters, of real deep spiritual search, and sometimes even anger. Like, what are you doing? What's wrong with you? Why are you doing all of this? And that's part of our growth, right? That's part of our growth as people of faith, is that we have these difficult conversations with God, and we ask those questions, and then we wait with stillness for the answer that he's going to bring to us. I can't give you an answer of what this means for you, right, Deb? I can maybe start looking at what it means for me, what it maybe means for my family, but I can't do that for you. And so again, it's the trust and the faith and the remembrance, and bringing that into our daily practice so that we're able to go inside and hear for that still, quiet voice inside.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the next question we have, where do you get your inspirations from to carry you through difficult times? You've mentioned quite a few of them throughout the presentation, things that we can do, we can access, and if you're feeling comfortable to maybe share on some of the things that you draw on that really help you, it may help others as well.
That is a really, really good question. I'll be honest, at the beginning, I was not where I am today. It took effort, it took time for me to get really thoughtful about how am I going to keep going in this. So by profession, I'm a therapist, right? And so my job is to hold people's pain. That's my job. And I had so much pain, and there's so much pain in my family that I didn't feel strong enough. And so really quickly, I needed something to help me during this time. So one of the first things I did was I have a daily writing practice. So every day I wake up, I brush my teeth, I go to my writing spot and I write. And it's an interesting writing process. It's called Writing Down the Soul. I read this book called Writing Down the Soul. And so what you do is you write, and you just write every day, every day, every day, and just write. And then suddenly, I don't know how to explain, but suddenly that it'll change. And suddenly the voice that you're hearing won't be your rational, logical, reasonable voice. It'll be another voice in the writing. And what that voice is, Allah knows, but maybe it's that inner still voice that I've been speaking about. So every morning I do my writing. So first I do that, jot down like all the things that are stressing me out, and then I wait. And then sometimes that other writing comes. Sometimes it doesn't, right? But that writing, that daily writing has really, really been an anchor for me. The other thing is what I mentioned, those Friday gatherings with my family online. That's been, there's been Fridays that we've been so sad and low and tired and nobody wants to do it. So we just wear our jeans, like whatever. You don't have to get dressed up for this, but we show up, right? And when we show up, we're showing up with all our full hearts. And so that's another thing. And the third thing I would say, to be really honest, is seva, is serving others, finding just little ways to help other people out. Whether that means sending a funny meme over a text, right? Or whether that means doing something like this, little and big ways to help other people. Because what that reminds me is it reminds me how much privilege I have, right? How I do have a caring home environment, which not everybody has. I do have enough food on the table, which not everybody has. I do live in a country where they're doing their best to support us, which not everybody has. And so when I can serve, in order to serve, I have to have overflow, right? So that means I have to make sure I keep filling my tank every day, making sure I have a little bit of downtime, a little bit of, the writing time. I go outside as much as I can and walk in nature. That's really important to me. Whether I do that alone or with my kids, it doesn't matter. I just try to get outside. And if I don't feel like going for a walk or it's raining, I just sit on the balcony in the back, right? And just watch. Those things have sustained me, I would say. There's probably more, but those are the ones that come to mind, as you asked the question. Great question. Thank you.
I love that. And I would echo, I do actually all of those things as well, except for the writing one. I think I may have to incorporate that one every morning into my life. I think that that's something that would help us to do the things that you talked about, with the moon and, get a little bit retrospective and just kind of put it out there and then reflect after we've put it out to see exactly how we're communicating those messages to ourselves. Because when you write it out, it's like, well, then you can see exactly what you're saying to yourself, right? Exactly. So that's an amazing practice. I think I might actually incorporate that. Thank you. Okay, so I know we could just talk for hours on this subject. It's very interesting, but I think we're going to have to go to our last question because we're nearing the end of the hour. So the last question we have is, how do we balance din and dunya when there is so much pressures in the world right now? Some are, not working. People are struggling paying bills, and rent. In some cases, other people are working, but they're working, instead of 8 hours a day, they're working 16 hours a day, but getting paid just for 8 because there's just so much to be done with fewer resources. And I think there's a dichotomy between those two extremes as well. And so, what is your perspective on that?
That's a really meaningful question for many, many people. And what I would say is perhaps we start shifting the way we think of deen and dunya. Rather than a scale, what if we thought of deen as what fuels dunya? The faith as what supports us in our everyday life. So it's not like I do this for my deen and I do, because in Islam, they're one, right? We split them out to make sense of it. We call it the sun and the moon. We do all that, but in lived reality, it's one. And so I would say this time more than ever is about going inside so that we have the inner fortitude to do the things that are required of us in a dunyavi sense. So maybe reframing it that way, and then asking ourselves individually, like I said about going inward, what is it for you that helps you go inside? And spending time and not thinking of that as like wasted time or too much work. Because one thing I found is when we build that into our daily practice, when it's a dedicated thing, just like brushing our teeth, we do it every day, then you have that, right? It's like, again, with the brushing teeth example, if you don't brush your teeth every day, you're going to get cavities, you're going to have to go to the dentist, they might even pull your teeth out. So every day you do it to maintain. In the dini sense as well, right? Every day we polish and we polish and we polish. So when it's time to look in that mirror, we can see ourselves clearly. Where that polish is that daily engagement with our own spiritual self. And of course that means the divine. However that looks for people, it's hard to get words to say like what I'm trying to say, but I hope you're capturing it, right? Like the daily connection, commitment, that will then prop us up in our dunyavi world.
Yes, thank you. And it is really all about striking that balance and trying to create time and space for both aspects, regardless of what's happening, so that we can nurture the soul and keep ourselves rejuvenated every day.
Deb, if I could interrupt you, one last thing around that is that it doesn't have to take long, right? Dunyavi things take a certain amount of time. Dini things, in the spirit, in the land of spirit, there's no time. Time is a human material concept. And so if we can remember that it doesn't have to take, half an hour, 3 hours, it can be a moment of just recentering, reconnecting, remembering who's in charge, right? That's it. And then we go on with our day. So it doesn't have to be like, okay, now I have to dedicate another 35 minutes or 55, whatever it is. It's an instant, because there's no time in that realm.
That's really important, I think, as well. So thank you for reminding us of that as well. Okay, so I think at this time we're going to conclude the Q&A portion of the webinar. And I'd like to remind everyone once again about the access line that allows you to access resources, information, or assistance of any type. The number is 1-888-536-3599. You can also visit iicanada.org for further information on how to contact the access line. And really do encourage you, it's a fabulous resource. So as we conclude, we would sincerely appreciate your feedback on today's webinar. And if you wish to access it immediately, you can see the link on the screen and type it into your browser, or you can view the description on the video under iicanada.live or in the YouTube link under description, depending on how you access this webinar today. And once again, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for taking the time to participate in this webinar. I'd also like to thank you, Alweza, Dr. Saira Sabzali, for sharing your knowledge and inspiration on this topic of why this is happening and addressing the deeper questions in the midst of crisis. And I'd like to thank all of the volunteers once again and the resources for making tonight's webinar possible. A recording of this webinar will be available on the II Canada website in the coming days. Please visit iicanada.org for additional information, upcoming programming, and ways to stay in touch with the Jamaati institutions. And this concludes our webinar. Thank you, and Yali Madad.
Yali Madad.